Hello, and thank you for joining the podcast Emergency Minute. Your host is an emergency medicine physician who brings over 20 years of experience in healthcare. Dr. Parente will take you through some of the trending topics and challenges faced in the ER and all of healthcare. Join in the fight against misinformation. And don't forget to follow on social media at Dr. J. Parente. Now, here's your host, Dr. John Parente.
All right, welcome back, everyone, to Emergency Minute. This is the first episode of 2024. Happy New Year! Just kidding. In all reality, I'm sorry I didn't get an episode out sooner. In January, I got sick for a while, lost my voice, was working about 80, 90 hours a week, and really could never recover. I sound bad enough just at baseline, much less without a voice, so I appreciate your patience. But welcome. I'm excited. 2024 is going to be awesome. I'm very excited to get into the weeds here on this show. A little bit of information from last year, 2023. Emergency Minute was 18 episodes long and was nearly 500 minutes, heard in over 40 countries and nearly 3,000 listeners. And apparently that puts me in the top 50% of all broadcasts. However, I suspect that's kind of what they tell everybody so that they come back and continue to give the money to Buzzsprout for producing the show. So thank you for that. But no, in all seriousness, I do appreciate everybody listening and participating in the show. Lots of comments on social media. As always, you can find me on just about any social media platform at Dr. J. Parente. Now, if you haven't done so, please feel free to leave a review and tell me how horrible I am and how horrible this show is. Or you could say how great it is if you think that's the case. All right, so what did we talk about 2023? We covered a lot of different things. We talked about fever. We talked about flu. Why does the ER visit take so long? We did kind of walk through like what an ER visit looks like and what a day in the life of an ER physician looks like. We touched on some other things like some crazy cases down in the Bahamas where people were dying. And then we also talked about Damar Hamlin collapsing on the field. We talked about obesity medicine. And then my favorite was the final episode, Healthcare is Broken. If you haven't heard that one, that's episode number 18. You might want to go check that out. Now, today we're going to do hypothermia and cold weather emergencies. We're going to talk about this because there's a lot of misconceptions out there. But before I do that, I wanted to say a little hello to the people that may be new to the show. So my name is John Parente. I'm an emergency medicine physician. And the reason why I did this show is because I wanted to talk about trending healthcare issues and sort of connect the general public to healthcare and the healthcare professionals and kind of how we see the world on the inside, and then how you may see the world or how the world is being painted for you, depending on how you look at it, and media, social media, etc., and try to connect those two worlds. And also, I fully recognize how disastrous and how broken the healthcare system is. And so this is a way for me to kind of talk about that to cope, I guess, for lack of a better term. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about cold weather emergencies, but I also want to promote next week's show, which is going to be our first ever guest. Dr. Kevin Lewis, my assistant director, is also going to be joining us on the show, and we are going to talk about CPR and DNR. If you want to talk about things that are absolutely misunderstood in the general public, even nursing homes, even just fringe medical areas, people have no idea what DNR means and really what the different flavors of DNR exist, and all the misconceptions surrounding CPR. When you watch it on TV, there's, everybody makes it back to life. Well, that's not the real world. So we're going to talk about that on the next show. But today, because it's cold outside, cold weather emergencies. All right, let's start off with the obvious, frostbite. Now, there's different levels of this. There is frost nip, which is a very severe, kind of a cold-induced, what we call a paresthesia, which means like some numbness or tingling into your, arms or legs or whatever body part is being affected. Now, this will resolve with rewarming, so there's actually no damage to the tissue. So that's kind of the difference between like a frost nip versus frost bites. Wanted to nip that in the bud. Bad jokes all around. All right. So what's the thing that happens first? Well, you have this thing that's called vascular shunting. So vascular shunting just means that the blood vessels in the tip of your fingers and toes and even into your nose and earlobes will start to sort of clamp off. And that's a body's like defense mechanism for keeping the blood into the core and protect the vital organs such as your heart, your liver, your kidneys, ultimately your brain, of course. But it's a way to sort of rob the extremities and the things that are quote unquote less important and keep it for core temperature for survival. So it's actually kind of a really neat survival mechanism. Now, you've definitely experienced this before. I mean, your fingertips get cold. Sometimes they get kind of pale and white, and same thing in your toes. If you're standing there at like a Browns game and it's super cold outside and you like can't feel your toes, you're like, man, I can't feel my toes. That's kind of where that shunting starts. And that's where, you come back inside the house. And then what do you feel? What do you feel when you come back inside? In about 5 minutes, you feel completely flushed, right? Everything opens up. Those are the vascular shunts that are opening back up. And a lot of people will get a red nose, right? All of a sudden the nose starts to get real red. The earlobes get real red. You get perfusion back into your fingertips and your toes. And what else happens? Yes, your nose starts to run. Why is your nose running? Because all of those capillaries and all those blood vessels are opening up and you're getting this massive influx of blood to the places where it was being robbed before. Kind of a cool thing. The body can do some really cool things for like just innate defense mechanisms for survival. So that's kind of the first thing that happens. All right, so how do you get frostbite? Well, there's different forms of frostbite, and there's different grades like 1st degree through 4th degree or grade 1 through 4, depending on how you classify it. We're not really going to get into that. The 4th degree is sort of a mummification of your fingers or toes. Hopefully you never find yourself in that scenario. That happens around like 4 to 10 days. You guys know I'm active on social media. I make a lot of videos, some of which are funny, some of which are not at all funny, and then some of which are actually informative. I kind of crossed both those streams. I know, according to Ghostbusters, Ray, you never cross the streams, but I did on Facebook last year and TikTok, and I put together this video where I stitched a video of a guy that actually had a mummification of his fingers and was like clicking his fingers on I think it was like an elevator door or something. And I did that for like 5 or 10 seconds. And then I talked about, frostbite and stuff like that. Well, the thing went viral on Facebook. It had, I think, like 2 million views. And it's funny because a lot of the people were like, this is BS. This is not real. Those are, wax fingers. You can tell. And it's actually not true. They actually were real fingers and the guy had to have them amputated. Anyways, just kind of an interesting video. If you want to be horrified like some of our friends, it's pretty disturbing to see mummified fingers. All right, so how do we treat frostbite? Well, first and foremost, get the hell out of the cold, which, often, easier said than done for a normal healthy person walking around. Normally you can escape, but if you find yourself in the middle of Alaska in winter and you get lost or something like that, obviously that's where you get into trouble. So step 1 is to get out of the cold. Step 2 is then to remove wet clothing. Now, what's crazy here is if you're gonna be stuck in this cold environment for whatever reason, don't rewarm. And I know that sounds crazy, but you can't. What you don't want to do is rewarm, and then you're still in the cold, because that's just going to actually make your tissue injury get worse. So let's pretend in this scenario that we're just going to get out of the cold to begin with. So if that's the case, get out of the cold. Step 1. Step 2, remove wet clothing, and then you're going to start to rewarm. Now, the one thing you have to actually think about if you're really frostbitten and you're really cold and the damage has been done to your tissues is that your ability to feel things is going to be much less. If you ever sat on your foot or something like that, then you stand up and you can't feel your foot, right? And people have broken things and they've like kicked the couch on accident and things like that, and you can actually have a broken bone and it really won't hurt that bad until 15 minutes later when that feeling kind of comes back. So the same thing can be said for frostbite. Like if you're taking, your jacket off or something and your fingers are frozen, yeah, you can break them pretty easily. So you have to be real careful. You can do damage not just to the bones, but also to the soft tissue. So then what do? Well, you rewarm the body part with warm and no, not hot water. Now, if no water is available, like you're, in the wilderness or something like that, and you're just coming inside, you can try to use other body parts, such as, thinking of putting your fingers into your armpits. There's a chance that, like we talked about before, if that extremity is going to refreeze, then don't rewarm it, but just focus on getting out of the cold. Now, what you don't want to do is rub the area, because like we talked about, you'll have diminished feeling and sensation. You can actually cause tissue damage. The other thing you want to avoid is don't put it close to a stove or fire, as you can burn the tissue and not realize it because those nerve endings have been sort of deadened or damaged at that time. Now, in a hospital, we will rapidly rewarm you with more of a warm/hot water. So 99 to 102 degrees. So if you think about a hot tub is a temperature of around 100 to 105 degrees. Now this is actually pretty painful. So you're likely to need an IV for pain medication. So they don't recommend doing this if you're on your own and you're not under the care of a medical professional. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions out there. People always say, oh, no, you can't use hot water. That's true. You can't. Because it's painful, number one. And number two, you're putting yourself at risk for burns because you may not be able to detect how hot the water is because the nerve endings are damaged. But make no mistake, we want to rapidly rewarm you in a controlled environment with warm or hot water to an extent. And that's done, obviously with the care of a physician. And yes, I've done this many times. We do it every winter. And then it is very painful when you get that sort of reperfusion, those nerve endings start firing, etc. So you will also need a tetanus update because it's one of the weird ways that you can get tetanus. And as I explained to people, it'd be a really silly reason to die next week if you didn't get a tetanus shot. 50% mortality at 7 days. And you also may need antibiotics, but that's on a case-by-case basis. There's really no proof that empiric antibiotics are going to prevent anything, but it really depends on the damage of any sort of tissue injury, where it is. Is it on your hands? Is it on the palmar surface versus the other side, which is called the dorsal side? Are you diabetic? All these different things that sort of go into our decision making. Now, in severe cases, you may need something called TPA, which is a clot busting medication. And the reason why is because frostbite can cause thrombosis, which is a blood clot to the extremity. I've never seen this. I've never done it, but I know it does exist. People who practice in other places of the world, like Alaska or Antarctica, something like that, they may be more able to comment on this, but that's as far as we'll go with that. All right. Now, obviously, this untreated can lead to death of tissue, can lead to something called a gangrene infection, and obviously can lead to amputation, and if you're really unlucky, even death. All right, so in addition to frostbite, we can also talk about hypothermia. So what is hypothermia? Well, it's basically just a prolonged exposure to being in the cold. Now, at this time, the body does its normal things, but eventually the temperature drops below that 90 to 95 degree area. And that's sort of the danger zone, which is 32 to 35 degrees Celsius for everyone else in the world who's not American. All right, so what happens? Well, we talked about the shunting before. The body does go into survival mode, tries to protect the vital organs. So after shunting, you get things like shivering. Now, what is shivering? Well, shivering is the body's innate defense mechanism to try to generate its own heat for survival. So it causes muscle contractions. And we've all had this. We've all, been standing outside and been shivering and saying, why am I shaking? And that's the reason why. The body is actually trying to generate its own heat, which is kind of cool if you think about it. So you eventually will get worse, though, if you're in the cold and you're just, this prolonged exposure, the body's core temperature continues to drop. And at this point, you get into some pretty nasty things. This is where you get into your respiratory rate slowing down, your heart rate slows down, you can get super confused. And, the more time you spend below that 90, to 95 degree core temperature, your risk of death increases. Now, most people really don't have to worry about this, right? Like we have heat, we have, heat in our vehicles, we have coats, the average person really doesn't think about this kind of stuff on a daily basis. But if you're a psychopath like me and you think about these things, then you bring a blanket in your car at all times just in case you may need it. So when do we see this in the ER? Well, typically you see the old person who falls outside in the middle of winter. They break their leg and they get stuck and it's freezing cold and maybe they left their cell phone in the house or things like that. That's when you can get into these very scary, very dangerous things. These are absolute horror stories when these people come in and they've been outside for like 10 hours. They're literally parts of their body that are frozen. It's actually hard sometimes to get an IV. I'll never forget a case we had previously where we were trying to get an IV on this individual, but they basically had frozen arms and frozen legs. So we ended up having to do lines in their neck, and you have to get kind of creative and do some crazy things sometimes for these patients because you can't put the IV through frozen tissue. It's actually very difficult because that tissue gets real hard. If you think about, like a frozen hot dog, for example, these are great examples. I'm sure you guys are like, what in the hell am I listening to? But I digress. This is, one of the things that we have challenged in the emergency department. So you have to think about your, elderly patients and things like that, your loved ones, talk to them about their situation in their home. Do they have life alerts? Make sure they have their cell phones in their pockets, things like that. And if they're going outside in the middle of winter, you just have to exercise some caution, and hopefully, they have people checking in on them from time to time as well, because some of these cases are just absolute disasters where people come in and they're literally half frozen. So kind of, some scary stuff, but nonetheless, that's when we kind of see this stuff mostly in the emergency department. Now, if you guys remember, I don't know if local people from Ohio, there was this tragedy on the turnpike last year where there was like 65 cars that had crashed or something like that. It was a big crash on the Ohio turnpike. Now, that's a situation where, if your car's working and you have enough gas and you get stuck in this big giant, pool of 60 cars that are all, piled on top of each other, if your car's working, great. If you have enough gas, great, like you can stay warm. But obviously this is where, mom tells you don't leave the house without a jacket. See, there's good reasoning there. Thanks, mom. See, you were right about this thing like all along. So, and if you're a psychopath like me, you keep a blanket in your car at all times. And we use it all the time. Actually, our kids love it. So I think that's something to kind of consider as well. Now, we can't talk about cold weather emergencies without discussing car accidents and falls and flu season. So we'll get to that. One of the things that always gets asked of me is like, do we see a lot more car accidents because of the slippery weather in Ohio? Yes and no. I think we see more of them because, people are, sliding off the road and that kind of stuff. But I think in general, there's less injuries. And this is just, I don't have any evidence to prove this is just my own experience because people are going slower. I mean, you can't go, in the summertime, we see just horrible traumas because people are going 100 miles an hour, the motorcycles, etc. But in the winter, there's no motorcycles for the most part, and people are generally trying to go slower and, kind of be cautious. So even if they do get into a car accident, there's usually sort of less energy and less trauma involved. Falls are the bane of my existence. We jokingly say in the emergency department, gravity is sure strong around here because people fall all the time. So obviously we see, slip and falls. We see, slips on the ice, fall down the stairs, things like that. Some of the most common things we see, something called a Colles fracture, which is where you break basically your wrist. It's actually your distal radius and your ulna, which are the two forearm bones there. Now we also see, so that's someone that tries to catch themselves as they fall to the ground. In some regards, it's actually better just to sort of let it happen, but the body's not really trained to think that way. Sometimes when you put that arm out to try to catch yourself, that's where you actually cause the broken bone. The second thing we see very commonly is something called a trimalleolar fracture. Now this is a nasty injury where you slip and fall and somehow your foot points in the wrong direction compared to your ankle. And so this is like 3 broken bones plus a dislocation usually to your ankle. Your entire ankle is destabilized. This is something that we see very frequently. I'll never forget a case, one of the ER physicians I worked with in residency who was taking the trash out and he slipped and fell on the ice and he looked down at his foot and it was pointing in the wrong direction. And he knew that at that moment he had a trimalleolar fracture. And before the pain truly set in, he reached down and straightened out his foot. I remember asking him, you did that? You thought that was the best idea? And he goes, well, I've taken care of so many of these people before and I know how much pain they're in. And I figured, you know what? I'm just going to just straighten this thing out now and try to reduce that pain down the road here. So I don't know. It's kind of interesting. I guess maybe that's what I would do. I don't know. I'm luckily, thank God, never been in that exact situation. So the trimalleolar fracture is something that we very much see, ankle fractures as well. And then the biggest one, and the one that has a lot of mortality is the hip fracture. And this is something that I always worry about with elderly friends and loved ones is the hip fracture. Because why do I worry? Well, because there's a 5-fold likelihood of death in the first year for an elderly person that slips and falls and breaks their hip. So mortality means chance of death. So 5 times more likely in the first year. So, depending on what you read, the mortality rate is anywhere from 15 to 58%, which is a huge range, but basically it increases quite a bit. So the way I look at it is if you're older and you break your hip, you have a 1 in 4 or maybe a 1 in 2 chance of death in a year. So humans really weren't meant to not walk. And bad things happen to us when we are bedridden. We get things like pneumonia, we get bed sores, we get UTIs, we develop sepsis, and we develop blood clots, and we end up in the hospital in and out over a year. And this is how people die. The human body was not meant to just lay around. it's important always, obviously, to try to stay active. Think about your loved ones, visit them, check on their homes, make sure they don't have any like throw rugs or other things that could potentially lead to them, tripping or falling in their house. Talk about installing some guardrails into their, bathtubs and just different things like that. You can actually have someone come out to your house and sort of geriatric proof it, for lack of a better term. Like we're used to like baby proofing houses, but you may need to have someone geriatric proof your house if you have someone that's elderly that's living with you to sort of minimize risk of falls. All right, moving on to another thing that we see most commonly in the winter months would be carbon monoxide. Yes, the odorless, tasteless gas that you really don't even know is there. So obviously, please, people, go out right now. Check your carbon monoxide detectors in your house. If you don't have one, please buy one. They are very cheap and they could save your life. So I had a couple cases I wanted to talk to you about recently, but first I want to kind of talk to you about what carbon monoxide does. So carbon monoxide, I'm going to keep it kind of simple just to kind of explain what it does, but basically it's a gaseous molecule that will go into your body when you breathe it in, and you don't even realize it's there. Now, what happens, it sort of displaces the oxygen. So if you think about, your hemoglobin, which is the sort of the proteins inside your blood, if you think about them as little delivery men and they just drive around your body all day long and they deliver oxygen and nutrients to the places that it needs to go, but they also pick up the wastes, from the cellular waste and that kind of stuff and takes it out of the body. So you have all these little things driving around your body. And basically what happens is instead of the oxygen being delivered to the tissue, it's displaced by the carbon monoxide molecule. And essentially that's what causes the damage to the tissues because you're not getting enough oxygen. Now, most people don't even realize this is happening. So yeah, you can get headaches. You can feel kind of crappy, like that malaise. You just feel awful, maybe some dizziness. And you can even develop things like chest pain and stroke symptoms and things like that. You're not really going to get short of breath until it's probably too late because this will impact tissues before it really is impacting just primarily your lungs. So this is kind of a difficult diagnosis to make. And as my one attending in residency once said to me, Parente, if you don't think about it, you won't diagnose it. Now, yes, in medicine, sometimes we stumble upon a diagnosis. If we're, thinking, this is probably a kidney stone, and then we do a CT scan, and lo and behold, there's the appendix, and it's, all big and inflamed, and oh my gosh, they have appendicitis. Huh, that's crazy. Now, the reality is your physician probably at least thought about that, but sometimes we do stumble across diagnoses. For example, if I, do some what we call screening labs, meaning you don't really know what the hell's wrong with this patient, so you're just going to get some blood work to kind of see if there's anything that gives you a clue. All of a sudden, boom, oh wow, their hemoglobin's 6, and normal is like, at least 10, but most people are 12 or 13, and you're like, oh wow, they're really anemic. Okay, so we do stumble across these diagnoses from time to time. Doesn't happen that often. However, it is impossible to stumble across a diagnosis of carbon monoxide. The only way to detect carbon monoxide is to do a specialized test called an ABG, arterial blood gas. And that's an arterial test where you measure the carbon monoxide level in your blood. So this is not something that we're going to get lucky and stumble upon. This is something that we have to think about actively as ER physicians. So I want to talk to you about 2 cases I kind of got really lucky on recently that I thought were interesting, and maybe they can pertain to you or save a life somewhere. So the first case was a patient that was coming in with stroke symptoms. They called from EMS. They said, oh my gosh, this guy's having a stroke. Let's activate the stroke alert. And, he had a complete paralysis on one side of his body. And so, they're coming here. And then all of a sudden they called us back. EMS called us back and they're like, oh, now he's having chest pain. So, in residency, one of the things we always learned about, especially in emergency medicine, was always be weary of someone that has chest pain, but also has neurologic symptoms. You can have some pretty nasty things, dissections and things like that. So I'm already sort of on heightened alert. Like, well, this is not good. This guy coming in. So I go see this guy. Honestly, I don't know what it was. I don't know what it was, but I said, this is not stroke and this is not heart attack. Obviously, of course, we worked him up for both. Of course, I'm not that cavalier or stupid. But I just asked the guy after I went through the whole stroke exam and I went through the whole chest pain thing, risk factors, etc. And I just asked the guy, I'm like, were you working on a car today? And I don't know if it's because I smelled, kerosene, or if it's because he kind of had on like a shirt that looked like he might be like an auto mechanic. And he was like, yeah, I was working on a car. And I'm like, oh. And I'm like, was the car on? And he's like, no. I'm like, are you sure? And he's like, no, the car was not on. And he's like, and the doors were open and everything. I'm like, okay. I'm like, well, so I was just like, you know what? I'm going to check an ABG. So we're going to check for a carbon monoxide level, send the guy over to do his CT scans and all this stuff. Before the CTs were even back, I had the carbon monoxide level and it was, I forget the exact number. I think it was around 20 at that time. So he's going through the stroke workup, and of course all that stuff comes back negative. His heart stuff came back negative as well. So he came back over to the department, put him on 100% oxygen. We still ended up admitting him to the hospital to kind of, number one, to continue to treat his carbon monoxide levels, because a normal level, so if his level was 20, a normal level is like 0 to 1. Now, smokers can get up to like 5 or sometimes 10 at like the very most, but anything like over like 10, 15, 20, like that's very much positive. And remember, I'm measuring this well after the fact that, the patient was in this environment, which, obviously had the most amount of carbon monoxide. So I go back and talk to the guy and I'm like, bro, like you said your car was off. And he's like, yeah, no, the car was on. He's like, but I've been doing this for years. I've never had any issues and all this stuff. And I'm like, oh my God. So you're in a garage with the car on and you're working on your car. And I'm like, oh my God, well, you have carbon monoxide poisoning. And what's interesting is, so the wife came in and she was like, no way. Are you sure? No way. It can't be that. I'm like, it is that. So anyways, he ended up doing fine. He ended up getting full workup and, so everything checked out on him. So that's good to see. All right. So then the other case I had was a couple of weeks ago where I had a guy that was like in his 30s who had come in with chest pain and palpitations. Now, what was interesting about this guy is he didn't look like someone would go to the doctor unless like something was seriously wrong. This was definitely not someone that had been to the ER recently. He had absolutely no medical problems whatsoever. And he just basically came in with chest pain and palpitations. Again, I don't know why. I got lucky. I don't really know what happened. We did a full cardiac workup. Everything was negative. I went back in and talked to the guy because something just didn't seem right. I kind of was asking him about heating devices and things like that. And then he was like, oh yeah. It's been really cold. So I've been using this like space heater in my house and I have it, cranked way up. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I added on the carbon monoxide level through an ABG. And lo and behold, it came back and it was like 20 at that time. Again, very abnormal. And this was, probably 2 hours after going through the whole cardiac workup and everything else and making sure everything else was okay. So his level would have been much higher had I measured it right off the rip through the door, but I really had no reason to order it in the beginning. So again, better to be lucky than good. But yeah, just two very interesting cases I've had recently. So go and check your carbon monoxide detectors. This honestly is one of those things that could save your life. All right, so that's basically a quick summary on some cold weather emergencies that we see. I want to thank everyone for joining me today, and for next time as well, we're going to discuss this CPR and DNR. So I'm very excited about this. Thanks to everyone who comments on my social media posts, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and also my YouTube channel. I greatly appreciate it. And this is a great place for you to reach out to me and give me suggestions for shows. The show that we're doing next time is CPR and DNR, and this was actually a recommendation from one of my listeners on social media that commented, so I do appreciate that, and we'll give them some love on the next show. So hope everybody's else doing well. Stay out of the cold, stay out of the carbon monoxide, don't slip and fall and break your hip, and as always, remember to keep a blanket in your car. Thanks, Mom. All right, as always, peace, love, and happiness to everyone out there. Cheers.
Thanks for joining us this week on Emergency Minute. Join us next time for more hard-hitting discussions on some of today's issues in healthcare. Don't forget to leave us a review on Spotify or follow on social media at Dr. J. Parente.